Right, so we're ready to go, Sarah?
We're ready to
Uh,
go.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this week's Patton College Research Forum. The Research and Graduate Studies Committee. I'm Gordon Brooks. I'm a faculty member in Educational Studies, and I'm serving on the Research and Graduate Studies Committee. And so we're sponsoring these forums throughout the year. Some of them to share research that our faculty and students are working on, and some of them, like this one, with a desire for a broader impact, where we're hoping to try to connect people who have interest in similar kinds of research pursuits. And so we are hoping that the things you hear today will be very exciting for you and will motivate you perhaps to study some things and maybe reach out and connect with our colleagues here to study some things. One of the things I'm hoping to learn today is whether it's rural, or rural. Where I grew up, it was rural. It was like Earl, all one syllable. But I know that people say it differently, and so waiting to hear about that. But today's presentation, Karen Eppley from Penn State, Sarah Hartman from Ohio University, and Dan Showalter, I will say, from Ohio University, but currently at Eastern Mennonite University, are here to present Why Rural Matters 2023, an overview with implications for Ohio. I'll introduce Sarah, and then Sarah's going to introduce her team. So Sarah Hartman is an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education and is an associate dean for faculty affairs and special projects in the University College at Ohio University. Her research focuses on school-community university partnerships, particularly in examining how partnerships impact access and opportunity in rural educational settings. She is a co-author on the last 3 editions of Why Rural Matters and a co-developer of the National Rural Education Association's Rural Agenda, Rural Research Agenda 2022 to 2027. She is also a promising practices editor for the Rural Educator. Boy, there's a lot of rurals in this, Sarah. And most recently is the co-editor of a book about rural education partnerships titled The Middle of Somewhere, Rural Education Partnerships and Innovation. In her community, she is the co-founder and co-board president of the Ohio Valley Museum of Discovery and is a faculty coordinator for the Professional Development School Partnership. Before working in teacher preparation, she was a classroom teacher. And so I introduce Sarah.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to start by introducing my colleague, Dr. Karen Eppley. Dr. Eppley is a teaching professor of education at Penn State University, where she specializes in rural education and literacy studies. Her research investigates how rural contexts influence literacy practices, curriculum, and teacher preparation, with an emphasis on equity and cultural relevance. Karen is the editor of the Journal of Research in Rural Education and an author on Why Rural Matters 2023. She's a member of the National Rural Education Association's Research and Higher Education Committee and is the co-editor of 2 influential books on rural education, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Rural Education in the United States and Teaching in Rural Places. Thank you so much for being here today, Karen. And now, Dr. Dan Showalter. Dr. Showalter is an associate professor of mathematics at Eastern Mennonite University. His research focuses on rural mathematics education, data analysis, and demographic challenges experienced by rural schools. Dan is a co-author on multiple editions of Why Rural Matters and has published widely on issues of equity and access in rural schools, contributing to insights on how data-driven approaches can inform education policy. In addition to his academic work, Dan frequently consults with school districts and educational organizations, helping them interpret and apply data insights to improve educational outcomes. When he's not engaged in research or teaching, he enjoys working with pre-service teacher candidates and mentoring them in applying mathematics and meaningful real-world concepts. Thanks so much for being here, Dan. And I'm going to go ahead and screen share to get us started. So we are here to talk to you about Why Rural Matters 2023. We're pretty excited about this edition of the report and are hoping that you will be able to find some important things to take into your own work today. Dan's going to start us off. Or actually, no, I'm sorry. Karen's going to start us off.
All right. We're going to walk you through the report using Ohio as an example. So you're going to get a real good sense of all this by the time we're finished. But I'll just give you kind of some background about the report. First, I should say that the report dates all the way back to 1999, and it originally was conceptualized by the Rural School and Community Trust. So it has a long history. Recently, it has been republished by the National Rural Education Association, and it will live with NREA for now into the foreseeable future because the Rural School and Community Trust is no longer an active organization. So the report analyzes the context and conditions of all 50 states. So it's meant to give a kind of national overview kind of in the opening pages, but then it gets pretty quickly into, you know what, here's what rural is looking like in your state. So if you go to that QR code, you can scroll through the entire report and you'll see that there are lots of pages, well, 50 to be exact, 50 pages of states that each give you some baseline data about what's happening with rural in your state. We're going to talk a little bit more about our indicators, but we just do want to call out that that last indicator 5 is one that changes over the course of the report. And for this edition, that indicator is about equity and well-being. And we additionally have a section kind of acknowledging COVID, although we didn't have COVID data yet when we made that section. And also another special section giving you some details about NREA's rural research agenda. Okay, is it slide with the agenda on it now?
It is.
Okay. All right. So we should pause for a minute and just be a little more clear what we mean about spatial equity. And for this report, we're really talking about distributive equity. So distributive equity refers to resource distribution. So that could be literal resources in the form of money to schools, but it also can be about service distribution because those services are ultimately paid for with money. And therefore, as well, access to educational opportunities. Also, that's under the distributive lens. We know in rural places that policies can make things better or easier for the people who live there. So you'll see in the report a kind of significant emphasis on comparing policies that can influence how rural kids have access to services and influence their achievement across the states. And I think now we're going to talk about where our data came from with Dan.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so there's no shortage of data available on the web, but we're very careful to maintain high standards for the data that we use in our report. We want it to be widely used by anyone who's interested in rural education. We want it to be nonpartisan, as objective as possible to start conversations and inform policy. So the first thing we do is we only use publicly available data, and this is mostly just so anything we do can be fact-checked. Anyone who's interested can go into the original data and double-check anything that we do. Second, and this can be frustrating at times, but we only use data that can be disaggregated by locale. So in other words, data that lets us separate out the rural areas from the rest of the locales where schools and districts would be located. And that's just a practical thing because the whole report is about rural and the health of rural communities and education. And then finally, we try to make sure that we choose indicators that are as interesting and relevant to the stakeholders, who would include all of you who are here today, and to the health of rural education across the United States. So we have a strong team, our author team, including Sara and Karen, and at NREA, the National Rural Education Association, and elsewhere. We have lots of people who are contributing to these decisions, but this is one of the important takeaways of this presentation today. We're also open to exploring new areas to include in future reports. And in fact, we're right at that discussion stage right now for our next report, which will be released next year. So if any of you during the question section or afterwards want to get questions to Sara or thoughts, ideas of different indicators to put in for the future. So where we're getting data, majority come from something called Common Core of Data. This is nothing to do with the Common Core state standards. This is just a centralized data set that has info on every public and private K-12 school in the US, hosted by National Center for Education Statistics. So that's a big bulk there. Then we have Ed Facts, where we get our graduation rates. That's Department of Ed. Office of Civil Rights has a lot of interesting data points. And for this report, we used the one on gifted education. National Assessment of Education Progress has some standardized testing data. And then the remainder coming through the American Community Survey, which is essentially the US Census, but it's the one that's taken on a monthly basis of a smaller sample of the US. So if we can move to the next slide. Gordon, I've edited this to acknowledge your question. So what is rural and how to pronounce it? We like to use a 1.5 syllable count as you pronounce it. So you want to be somewhere in between rural and rural. So if you can hit that 1.5 syllable, you're doing it right. Seriously, though, it is important to talk about the definition of what we mean by rural, because there are a lot of definitions out there. So because our report is often tied closely to policy decisions at the state, local, and even the US level, we do align it with the National Center for Education Statistics definition of rural. And the way that happens is, that's also tied into the census definition. There's basically 12 different locales. So 3 are urban, 3 are town, 3 are suburban, and 3 are rural. There's 3 levels of rural, mostly how close you are to a dense center of population. This definition is actually changing and will change probably within the next couple months. You're going to see some interesting news headlines, something like rural is growing at a rate, rural just gained 1 million students across the US. And that's not going to be quite true, but the definition is expanding. So places that used to be considered town or maybe even suburban will now be considered rural. We're not going to go into that now, but in our next report, we're going to cover that fairly extensively. I'm going to turn it back to Sara just so we can get a visual of what that rural actually means in the context of Ohio.
So here you're going to see a map of Ohio where you can see how these locale codes play out. And what you'll see is that Ohio has large geographic areas that represent rural fringe and rural distant, but not a lot of rural remote. And you'll see those population centers in Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton, Toledo, and you'll see those represented by the pink and the orange yellow colors for city and suburb. And then you'll see blue, which are the town areas kind of sprinkled in there. And I'm going to zoom in for taking a look at Athens County Public Schools. So you'll see Athens County, some of the surrounding districts, But mostly these show the lines of Athens County and what's represented there. And what's interesting, you'll notice that in the town of Athens, you'll see locale code 31, which is town fringe. And then you'll see a lot of rural locale code 41, which is that fringe area. With Belpre, for those of you who are familiar with the area, being the closest small suburb to Athens. So that's just to provide a little bit of context for us as we think about specifically Ohio, but then also for many of us recognizing that we have other campuses in Ohio as well. And I would encourage you to take a look and to maybe zoom in on how those locale codes look for those other areas. Also keeping in mind that these are going to be changing, although I was able to attend a session at the most recent NREA conference specifically about this. I don't necessarily think a lot of this is going to change for where we are located for those of us who are in the southeastern part of the state. And now back to you, Karen.
You can, okay, thank you. You can click all the way through that. I don't know why that's dropping in like that. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So we're just going to take a minute to explain some terms that we're throwing around and how those terms really contribute to the backbone of a report. In this case, we're talking about gauges. You hear us say the 5 gauges. So the 5 gauges you can think of them like as buckets of data. So there are 5 kind of buckets of data: importance of education, diversity, policy, outcomes, and the 5th one that I was talking about before that changes, and that's access to supports for learning. So within each of these 5 gauges, there are 5 indicators. For example, in the importance of rural education, one of the indicators is the raw number of students in the state. Another one is the percent rural schools in the state. And each of those 5 gauges has 5 indicators underneath. And those 25 indicators are weighted equally and then combined to form the overall ranking for the state as compared to another one. So for example, Mississippi is one that state will rank very highly versus Wyoming, which ranks lower. I think Ohio is somewhere in the middle. Am I right about that, Sarah? Okay, so those 25 indicators come back in the state pages. When you get to your state page, if you haven't already looked at that for Ohio, you'll see those 5 indicators and the 5 gauges, and in one kind of pretty one-page PDF-able state summary. In the opening pages of the report, as I mentioned before, there are special topics, COVID-19 impacts, and about the rural research agenda. Those will swap out every report. And on this report as well, I think it's after the state pages, there is a list of multilingual learner numbers. Okay, I think that's good because I think you're going to see all this particular to Ohio, which is going to be more interesting to you in a minute.
Yeah, so like Karen said, there's this ranking system. Let me talk a little bit more about what we mean by a ranking system. So we collect all these data and then we parse it out for the rural areas of each state. So we separate out only the rural schools, rural districts. And once we've done that, on each of our 25 indicators, we rank the states based on where their data for the rural areas of that state puts them. It's not the typical kind of competition where first place is necessarily a good thing. It's not a bad thing necessarily either. First place just means, for whatever reason, here are the states we should be paying particularly close attention to on this indicator. You can think of it like a flashing red light for policymakers, other stakeholders. Here's where we want to draw your attention. Doesn't mean that a low ranking shouldn't be given any attention. It's simply a way to help prioritize limited resources. And it can also be used within a given state to see where additional attention might be needed. So some states have higher overall priority needs, but every state in the US has areas they can be working on to improve the health of rural education in that state. And we're going to see that with Ohio here in just a second. Before we go straight to Ohio, let's take a look at the big picture and some broad findings we had. If we can go to the next slide. So a few of our finding was one, that new gauge that we put in with access to supports, that was very closely correlated with educational outcomes. So the support that states are giving their rural areas, states and US government is giving rural areas, is also closely connected to how students are performing. And that's not a huge surprise. I'll talk a bit about some specific findings here. So the first is within the health and wellness indicator. We were certainly interested in mental health in general, and especially in the wake of COVID. We found that on average, there is one school psychologist or guidance counselor or counselor, kind of putting them all together, one psychologist or counselor per 310 students in rural schools across the US. But this is an area where variance, it's important to talk about variance because there's some states where that ratio is 400 students to a single counselor. In fact, I think Michigan is even over 500 states. And then other states that are significantly better, such as New Hampshire, where the ratio is 149 students to a single counselor, which isn't necessary. It'd be better to even have more counselors than that, but that's relatively speaking, which is where a lot of the report falls. Second, we looked a little bit at the gifted and talented programming. It's disaggregated by gender. In this data set by the Civil Rights Data Center, we only have two, it's only male and female represented here. We wanted to see if there was equal representation for females in gifted programs in rural districts. And we saw that US-wide there is, it's almost exactly 50%. In fact, a little over 50% for female representation. That does vary from state to state, but not by too much. We did want to be careful. We got some feedback early on, and as we were developing the report, that there is still underrepresentation of females in math gifted programs. So we do want to leave that door open. And furthermore, racially, even though this wasn't a focus of the report, as I was going through the data, I noticed there was some pretty off representation. So for example, 17% of the students in rural schools currently are identified as Hispanic, and only about 9% of the students in gifted programs in rural districts identify as Hispanic. Similarly with Black, a little over 10% of rural students identify as Black, but only 5% of those receiving gifted programming identify as Black. And there's also some, of course, some problematic issues with separating out Black and Hispanic there too. This is, again, one of the limitations of the data set that we're working with. The next slide. So COVID made clear that adequate internet connectivity is an issue of equity, and we've seen that in rural Ohio. A little over 13% of rural households across the US lack even the minimum broadband connection, which was essential to education for a period of time and still is in many areas. In 6 of the states, there was 16.6% or higher of the rural households that didn't have that broadband connection. Another thing to mention, rural schools seem to offset some of the impacts of poverty. We've seen that in some educational studies in the past. In every state, rural students who live in homes with incomes below the poverty line scored lower on the NAEP, that assessment of educational progress, in both reading and math. However, that gap between students where they were living below the poverty line and students living above the poverty line, that gap was very different from state to state. So we took a look at that disparity and how big that disparity was in certain states versus other states. Finally, we looked at graduation rates, and this may come as a surprise to some, but if you look at rural students across the country and compare to all non-rural, so put all the other 9 locales in a bucket there, and you look at the graduation rates, the overall graduation rate for rural students is actually higher than the high school graduation rate for their non-rural peers. There were some states where it was lower. That's an overall. In some states, there's a couple states, Arizona and Alaska in particular, the rural graduation rate was at least 3 percentage points lower than non-rural, but that's an exception. And by and large, most states had the rural students graduating at a higher rate than the non-rural students. If we can move to the next slide. So taking a peek at, Karen mentioned the 25 indicators that go into 5 gauges, that go into a single overall rating. To be honest, I think this isn't one of the most helpful overall. It's packaging so much into a single number, but it does give you a little picture of what's happening across the US. I think we get a lot more actionable data when we zoom into some specific indicators. But you can see here that it tends to be that Appalachia, the southeastern US and the southern US, where we see a lot of the strongest needs. And of course, these line up with socioeconomic data as well. You can see that Ohio, its priority ranking, this is its overall for those 25 indicators, is 31, where again, first place would be the one with the most urgent needs. So here's where I would bring back that caution to, instead of saying, oh, Ohio doesn't really have any needs, looking in at some specifics that Sarah's going to go over soon here. The QR code, by the way, will link you to a document that has maps and graphs for every indicator in the report, if you haven't already gotten into that report. And if we can go to the next page. This is a similar, the same ranking. We're just looking at the actual numbers here instead of that geographic coloring system. So here you can see, if you look at the far right, you can see the quartile of states that ranked as the highest needs. You can also see where Ohio is currently, although again, I think it's most helpful to dive into the specific places where Ohio is working. So I'm going to turn that over to Sarah to give us some specifics.
Thanks, Dan. Now what you've all been waiting for, a view of Ohio state page. So this is what every state has. So if you look at the full report, you'll see that each state has their own state page. And on these pages, you'll find all 5 gauges with all 5 indicators. And then on the left side of each side of the page, you'll see a one particular data point that we pulled out to represent in some kind of other visual representation. So I'm going to walk us through each of Ohio's data for each of the 5 gauges, starting with the importance of rural education gauge. You'll notice that Ohio is ranked at 3rd or 23rd on this particular gauge. However, I want to emphasize again, as Dan said, that the report isn't about winning or losing or passing or failing. We draw attention to certain gauges and indicators as particularly meaningful, but it doesn't diminish the importance of others, either as sources of strength or as areas that need further support. You might find that a particular gauge aligns closely with the priorities of your own work. And also note that certain gauges that score in the notable range may still have room for growth, and areas that score as crucial may actually represent positive trends in the work that you're doing. So that's an important thing that we want to distinguish. Of pretty crucial, importance for Ohio is this number of rural students. Ohio ranks 4th in the United States for the sheer number of rural students it is supporting, followed only by Texas, North Carolina, and Georgia. The high concentration of rural students that we see in Ohio really highlights the need for dedicated attention to their unique educational needs and to creating opportunities for those students. We also want to highlight that although Ohio ranks in the lower half of states for rural district funding, only 24.9% of funds go to rural districts, despite the fact that rural schools make up about 30% of Ohio's schools. So this represents one of those spatial equity challenges that many of us encounter in our work within rural schools, both in Ohio, but in also other places. We're not going to talk about every indicator on the Ohio's page. We're just going to highlight some indicators, and we'll certainly be open to questions about other ones later as well. The next gauge is the family and student diversity gauge. And for this one, I want to start with an important caution that we've seen in other reports as well. A recurring emphasis is that because we are representing state-level data for most indicators, the analysis doesn't always capture the considerable variation that exists within rural contexts across states. So while an indicator can represent the statewide average, the realities are that specific communities may differ substantially. This is really true for particular data points like diversity and poverty, which tend to vary greatly across the state and may be concentrated in particular communities. Ohio is a good example of this. We actually highlighted this in the main pages at the beginning in our introduction to the report, because although Ohio's rural diversity index is at 16.8% with a rank of 44, there are certain districts that reflect much higher diversity rates, like Licking Heights, which has a rural diversity index of 68%, which definitely skews the overall ranking of Ohio on this indicator, which really does underscore the importance of understanding the local context beyond just the state averages. However, two other important gauges that indicators that I want to mention on this page that are at the halfway or just below the bottom half of states are the proportion of students who are receiving support and services through individualized education plans or IEPs, and the percentage of children who are experiencing poverty in Ohio. Both of these measures are essential in understanding the broader educational and socioeconomic landscape in Ohio, as students with IEPs can indicate a greater need for specialized resources and supports within schools, and higher levels of poverty often point to underlying challenges that impact students' ability to access opportunities or to engage in other things academically and personally. We would use these types of data points to really advocate for targeted, well-supported opportunities for rural areas across our state. And I think it's something that's important for many of you, probably in the work you're doing. And now our third indicator is third gauge on the Ohio page is the educational policy and context gauge. Policy is important because policy often drives access to supports and services. Yet federal and state policies are often notorious for inadequately addressing the needs of rural communities and rural schools. We can often see this. This is something that is an important part of the Why Rural Matters reports across every state. This gap is also evident in Ohio's policy gauge. One pressing need is this indicator about transportation. So you'll note that Ohio's ranking is 20th here. This places a really high financial burden on rural districts to pay for additional transportation costs. Additionally, Ohio's low match of state funds, only 0.86 for every local dollar raised, places the state in the bottom quartile nationally. This also highlights the need for Ohio to critically examine policies that ensure more equitable funding for rural districts. And now I'm going to move to the fourth gauge. You'll notice that as I go through these gauges that Ohio's score, the rank that you see on here changes. As Dan mentioned earlier, every state will see, almost every state will see variation in these scores for each gauge. So we started with Ohio with a score of 23 on the importance of rural education gauge. And now, we've seen 23, 44, 21, and now 42 on the educational outcomes gauge. This fourth gauge measures educational outcomes through the available national assessment data sets, specifically NAEP, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which measures student achievement in subjects like reading, math, and science at grades 4, 8, and 12. It's often referred to as the nation's report card. And we'll see that Ohio scores in the top quartile for rural NAEP composite in both reading and math for grades 4 and 8. I'm going to circle those on here so that you can see those. While there are many inequities associated with standardized testing, and we recognize those, these assessments are often used to guide policy, educational policy, to secure funding, and to advocate for resources for rural schools. So this is an important measure that despite issues associated with these assessments, Ohio's strong performance on these areas can be used to make a case for increased funding by highlighting the effectiveness of current programs and the potential for even greater success with additional support. So we want to highlight how even though, everything on these reports is not immediately a call for action. Oftentimes what we can find is that areas of strength can be used to advocate for those additional supports that may be needed. And finally, the fifth gauge, the one that is completely new for Why Rural Matters 2023. And this one, again, measures access to supports and opportunities for learning. And this fifth gauge, there are two indicators that are particularly concerning for Ohio schools. They are, one, the number of school-age children who do not have health insurance, and also the percent of rural households that don't have reliable access to internet, something that we all certainly became even more aware of during the pandemic. One thing that I would also like to point out is that Ohio has scores in the top quartile of rural children who are enrolled in public preschool. This is particularly important because public preschools increase access to learning opportunities for young children and also to access to early learning interventions and supports that are particularly needed in that age range. So you'll notice, though, that we have ended with a rank of 12, which, given the many equity components that make up this fifth gauge, really do speak to the importance of this gauge in Ohio and really paying close attention to some of the measures in this particular gauge. And now I'm going to turn it back to Dan to talk about our insert related to rural multilingual learners.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So this was kind of an add-in after the initial report had been published. The multilingual learner population in rural areas is one of the fastest growing populations, and you can see that there. We have some data points from little chunks across time. You can see that it's growing fairly rapidly. We also have, for rural Ohio, you can see that 1.1% of the rural population would identify as multilingual learners. So it's not as high in Ohio as it is in many states across the United States. However, this is still a population that certainly deserves our attention and it's worth identifying here. We can go ahead and move on.
So now we're going to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about what you're thinking or what questions you may have. We, as Dan mentioned before, we are really interested in knowing if there are particular pieces of information that you would like to see represented that would be helpful to your work, whether it's securing funding, working on policy, or completing research. What would be helpful to you, but also what resonated with you? What do you think could inform your future work? How do you think you might apply some of the findings to your own practice, whether it's in research, if it's policy driven, if it's in teaching? Again, what would you like to see in future editions? And are there any key takeaways that stick out to you? And if there aren't, that's okay too. Emily, go ahead.
I think you're muted, Emily.
Sorry, thank you. For my line of work in particular, one of the things that I would love to know and see in future work is the number of students in rural communities who have access to arts education. So, yeah.
Emily, I have a document open right now that's our ideas for the next report. So I will go ahead and throw that in there.
Awesome, thank you.
Medea, I think you're next.
Hello. Yeah, for me, of course, it would be interesting also to include adult learners. And so you talked a bit about the graduation rate. So I would love to see like a deep dive into that. I know that it's more focused on K through 12, but this is my field of work, and that would be something I'm interested to learn. What happens if students drop out, and how are they being serviced?
It's a great question.
Tom, I see how your comment or question relates actually to that one. Do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, I know with the switch in the Department of Education and adding what is work and job force development beside it, I know there's a lot of talk about vocational programs like the Pro Start program, which happens a lot in Ohio. I think there's about 3,400 students that are in the high school-based Pro Start program, which is the restaurant and hospitality industry. And so I'm often wondered about research around what schools offer that and what they see happens with graduation in that program. There's been some talk about discontinuing the Department of Education support in the state of Ohio for that program. So, and there's some other programs they're looking at that are more skill set based. So I'm wondering if that was a conversation from a question standpoint. Did you ask schools if they had access to VOTEC programs? And if so, were they, what was the participation rates of those students? And what are their graduation rates? And why access may or may not be important, especially in rural America, which offers and opens up jobs to them?
That's a great question. So every report, I think Karen or Sarah mentioned that fifth gauge is kind of a specialized gauge for that particular report. So I think it was maybe 3 reports ago, 3 or 4, that we did a focus on career and college readiness. And the college readiness side was fairly easy to get the data on. The career part, which I think you're alluding to, turned out to be really tricky because so much was done differently at every state level, and trying to get it in a cohesive format So I think that's something that continues to be on our radar, and maybe we'll end up in a special section at some time where we're not limited to a standardized way of measuring things across the US. But it's an excellent question, and I think it's certainly on our radar.
I do want to say that I think maybe there's an opportunity with the National Restaurant Association where they might be interested in having some research in that area, specifically in the state of Ohio, to try to maintain what is their ProStart program. So if you're looking for a research opportunity, there could be one there, I think, to make sure that that program doesn't fall away for those 3,400 students that are using it from an access standpoint. So, and I could talk to Sarah about that.
Thanks, Tom. Those special sections are ones that we pay. It's a big decision every time what's going to be represented in the special section, because we can only do so many of them, and there are so many important topics that we don't have a national data set to represent as an indicator on the report. So choosing those topics is important, and we really appreciate hearing from others what they would like to see represented, either on as an indicator if possible, or as a special topic. Edib, you're next.
Right. Thank you. My question is, there is just a lot of definitions of rural, and it got more and more complicated, and the number is increasing. Can I ask, why did you choose this one, and what is the benefits? Because for my work, I have to choose one of them.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reason we kind of settled on this 12 locale definition, the National Center for Education Statistics definition, is because of its close tie to policymaking and specifically funding. So a lot of the US funding for rural schools comes through the REAP program. There's a couple different grant programs, and they're tied to this definition of rural. So a lot of it was we just wanted to align with that, with acknowledging that there are many other ways to look at rural, and that's certainly something else that's on our radar of discussing and trying to paint what would the picture look like through a different definition of rural.
We have a question also in the chat. With the possibility of the elimination of the Department of Education, how do you see that impacting rural education and funding to rural schools?
Karen, I'll let you take that one.
Okay, that was fun.
You can say what you want.
Okay, well, first of all, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think there's good evidence, in part because the legislature is not split on that being the most, the legislature is split. So even within the Republican Party, not all Republicans want to abolish the Department of Ed because they see good opportunities there to advance their agendas. So that makes me feel hopeful and less hopeful. So I think our bigger worry is not, are they going to abolish the Department of Ed? But the bigger worry is what's going to happen to programs like Title IX, right? And how are they going to use the department in a way that advances an agenda that could be harmful? I think, but speaking of, like, just think about federal grants, I'm also not arguing there's going to be no impact. I think we've seen in the last 5 years or so a real increase in federal programs being called out specifically for rural, either within regular like EIR programs where you get bonus points if you are doing a rural study. I think potentially that's going to go away. I think those kind of changes we're going to see. But I will say with that we have funded our work before there was really much recognition at all for rural places from these big federal grant programs. And I think we will continue to find ways to fund our work after. So even that I don't really see as a death blow, but I don't think it's going away. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried. I think we should just maybe be worried about a different thing.
And I'll just jump onto that, Karen, on a hopeful note. Like, of all the different circles and communities and everything I'm part of, When it comes to rural education, I do see a very nonpartisan awareness of wanting to do what's best for our children. It ties into the humanity of you know, being parents and having children. That's not at all to say that there's a consensus on exactly how everything plays out, but I think there is strong. So when we've tried to like pass legislature related to rural education, I've often seen nonpartisan support um, for whatever's best for the children. And again, not to too rosy glow of how that plays out, but at least starting from the same point of caring for our children.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think there's broad concern for children of particular identities and you know, experiencing certain things in their lives that extends not only to all educational contexts, but in particular to rural context where the level of advocacy may be smaller. And so I think that is of real concern right now. How that will play out with the Department of Education, I think remains to be seen. But I do think that it's on our radar in thinking about how we represent the next version of Why Rural Matters, and especially in thinking about the special topics, because I think we can address talking about some of those things through our special topics.
That was a great question. Thank you.
We get a lot of requests to represent particular things in indicators, and we can't. And that is why those special topics become so very important. And why I would encourage everyone to look at the special topics, because there may be special topics that are still relevant that were, for example, in the previous Why Rural Matters, because we don't tend to always repeat those special topics every time. So, you may still find something in one of those special topics that can support your work, even if it was from one or two iterations of Why Rural Matters back.
I'll piggyback on that, Sarah. I was just at a community organization down in Southern Virginia, where about half of the people in attendance were really interested in early childhood. And Sarah had written one of those special sections on early childhood that was just packed with all these resources that I was able to refer them to. And they were just glowing with appreciation. So I'll pass that along to you, but also echo what you said there.
Jacqueline, I see your hand.
Hi, it's so great to see all three of you together presenting this. It's so well done. You've done a beautiful job today. This is just, I don't know, I trust you all to decide where this might factor in. But all three of you have been in conversations and in rooms with me where this has come up. And I think there's some possibility with the data in this report to help people better understand this. We all know, and it was brought up earlier, that workforce development and what happens for students post-secondary in rural communities is a very hot button topic. And any ways in future reports or with current data, I think that you can help people across the US doing this work understand that when we are just measuring post-secondary success by college going rates, that's really a detriment to our rural communities and students. And it often makes it look like there are deficits where there are not, where these students are going into really great fields or choosing another pathway. So just putting that idea out there, because I think it's also helpful when you're talking to audiences that don't quite know how to look at that information in a different way. And again, thank you. You all did a wonderful job today.
Thank you, Jacqueline. That's definitely something we will consider moving forward. And we're almost out of time. So if I could just take a brief moment to show you, because many of you may want to use this information to present to groups of students, to school boards, to local organizations, to your state leaders, anywhere where you might be advocating for rural education, you may want to take this information, whether you want to represent West Virginia or you want to represent Ohio, wherever. The National Rural Education Association has put together an incredible resource kit for everyone to use to be able to present this information in their own context. So just briefly, we want to show you the data dashboard, and this is on the NREA website. If you click on research and then find the Why Rural Matters report, you will find all of these resources there. And on this, you'll find the data dashboard where you can do more of a deep dive into particular states. If you're interested in, Nebraska, you can go to there to look for it if you're looking for more information than just what we've presented on Ohio today. You'll also find the communications toolkit that's going to put together all kinds of helpful resources for you, answer some quick questions that you may still have, has other social media content. If you're wanting to make posts about Ohio or other states, you can find those there, as well as the PowerPoint slide deck to be able to put together your own report. And again, here are some examples of things that you can put together to be able to customize a report for yourself. So for example, I know that there are local school districts around here who would be interested in seeing this information. School boards, there are definitely people at the state level who have not done a deep dive into what the results show for Ohio. So that would be something that if you are in a position to present that, you could use these resources to put those together. So the QR code to access that is on this slide if you want to be able to get in there and dig around a little bit more to see what's available to you. And I just want to emphasize that, again, we've highlighted some indicators on these gauges that really stand out for Ohio, but you can make a case for why each gauge and each indicator could be important to your work and to your context. And again, you can find this information for every state, not just Ohio. And you can even put together a grouping of states. We've done presentations for groups of states that are closely geographically related. So keep in mind that this can be used for advocacy in really any context you are working in, whether it is grant writing or policy writing or your own research. And we hope that you will explore it more and be able to find it to be a useful tool for you and your work.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, Karen, Dan. It was very interesting, and I think it will allow us to continue the conversation further into the future. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank everybody for coming today, and be on the lookout for the next announcement for a forum.
It's coming, and Why Rural Matters 2025 coming to you next fall.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.